Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to our webinar titled Understanding Healthcare Decision Maker Preferences for Optimized Engagement. This webinar is sponsored by ICON, so a huge thank you to them for helping to make this event possible. Joining us today, we're fortunate to have market research and payer experts participating in this webinar. I'll first introduce Earlene Biggs, who leads the market research and business analytics team at ICON to support strategic decisions and business planning. Next up, we have Dr. Gary Owens, a payer expert with more than 25 years of health plan experience in medical and pharmacy management. Our final speaker with us today is Renee Fleming, who has over 20 years of experience within managed care in product and pricing strategy of pharmaceuticals and strategic consulting using payer research and reimbursement analysis. It's lovely to have you all here with us today for an exciting event. If you'd like to read more about our speakers, you can click on the speakers bios tab located next to the video window. And I'd now like to hand things over to Earlene. Earlene, please take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay, so thank you. Thank you for joining us here. Our objectives for today are really to help understand what the U.S. healthcare decision maker preferences and how we can optimize engagement with them. If you go to the next slide, specifically what we're looking at is how our decision makers, our healthcare decision makers, are seeking information for products, what kind of formats they're preferring for their information sharing, and how can we leverage that as we try and engage them more effectively. So that's really what we're trying to understand this morning and what we want to share with you. Our intent this morning is to share some of the insights that we've learned from a biannual survey that we conduct with healthcare decision makers and discuss what that means for how we can engage with our healthcare decision makers and be more effective as we engage with them. So a little bit of background about the research we've done. Our most recent iteration was fielded in June of last year and included 101 participants split between decision makers from payer organizations, of 56 from payer organizations, and 45 that came from institutional providers, our key targets. There was a mix of roles that was included in this sample. Pharmacy and medical directors are our traditional go-to decision makers, as well as some other representation for C-suites, quality, patient care focused roles such as disease management, population health, and of course quality. So a pretty robust audience that gave a good mix of the customers, the stakeholders that we need to go to when we're trying to engage effectively. And what we learned from that survey, we hope to share with you today and about key preferences that these healthcare decision makers have in seeking and consuming information about products. And how can we operationalize some of those preferences into best practices so that we can engage these decision makers in a meaningful way. Next slide. So when we're thinking about engaging with our healthcare decision makers, one of the first questions that we ask ourselves is how do they seek product information? What are their go-to sources and approaches in trying to get that information for themselves? Next slide. So, obviously, or not surprisingly, internet first. Our healthcare decision makers are like everybody else in the universe. When they have a question, the first thing they do is try and Google it. There's a reason why that's a common saying, and our professionals are no different. So the growth in their go-to use of internet certainly has grown exponentially over time as technology has paced with that. And so that's their first step in seeking more information, just like most of us. But beyond that, some of the more traditional avenues in which we've tried to share information with our stakeholders, our healthcare decision makers, still have value. And we can see that direct mail has its role, as well as direct emails and ads. Those are still useful tools that decision makers rely on to gain information. And of interest to note is that institutional customers are really more open to direct mail and direct in this current environment. So they're still looking at more traditional means of gathering information than our payer customers. Next slide. So kind of along with that kind of trend toward I'm going to find information on my own, I want to do it at my own time, is a rise in on-demand sources of information that we can share and deliver to our customers. Traditional information such as podcasts or print journals and direct emails, still important, still have value. But we're seeing a growth in those on-demand forums, podcasts, webinars. So really it's that pull opportunity for information that our customers are moving towards at a growing rate. And I think that's important for us to understand, because two things that we can learn from that push for more access to information I can find on my own and have on demand is that we need to think about having strategies of engagement that include a search engine optimization tactics, and alignment between those on-demand sources as well as the traditional push sources of information that we have. So those things are really important when we think about strategy, is what are they using and doing to gain information, and how do we incorporate that in our strategies? So there's a mix there. If you go to the next slide, we see that, continuing the go-to sources where they're looking for information first, the bulk of their information are still traditional sources. And there is variation between the role that our decision makers have within an organization. With pharmacy and medical directors, again, our traditional go-to customers, manufacturer websites, print journals, and professional association and web journals float as up to the top. They're the top three sources that they go to beyond the internet search. And, that's very traditional, but that we see that on demand, that digital format kind of creeping up to the top at a steady rate, with the addition of interactive on-demand webinars and requests for on-demand access of the traditional sources like print journals and in their search for product information. And similarly, patient-focused roles, so disease management, quality directors, they're really open to some of those more technologically advanced and on-demand resources. Webinars and print journals, still those traditional sources are important, but again, having access online. And then voice assistants. So voice assistants is, the becoming more and more common in our everyday life. And we see that also moving into the professional life. And, hey, Alexa, help me know what, the treatment options are. That might be a little bit more advanced, but it's going in that direction for some. We have seen some interesting things with voice assistants. For example, using Alexa to help administer a at-risk survey for postpartum depression has really been a opportunity for uses of some of those technologies. And they help with the treatment process and assessment phase with patients in ways that are unique and cover those sensitive things. So we see that interest with those patient-focused roles as well coming up. So mix of that traditional approach as well as the new technology driven on-demand and interactive approaches become really important for our customers. Next slide. So we wouldn't be talking about engagement if we didn't also think about, well, how often do we need to meet with these decision makers, and who do we meet with? You know, that's been the core of our engagement strategy for a long time. And what we find is the cadence of the meetings that our healthcare decision makers want with representatives remain pretty consistent over time. And generally, what they're looking for from us is a cadence, a frequency of meeting with reps that is about every 3 to 6 months. So, you know, if you're meeting with your customers quarterly or you know, every 6 months, then that's about the right cadence that they're looking for in terms of trying to get updated information and maintaining that relationship. So being able to deliver on sort of that pace is beneficial and you know, consistent with planning that we've had in the past. But there is some variation in that desire for cadence. For example, if you have a product that's been on the market for a long time, it's a mature product, then, you know, the healthcare decision makers would like to see that consistency, frequency of in-person meetings, you know, to go a little longer. There's no real driver for them to get more information because they're confident that they already understand the product and its use. So if you have a mature product, you may see a push back on to kind of lengthen that time in between meetings. The other side of that is, you know, if you have a new product that's at launch, we see a shift in what the desired frequency is in those events. If you go to the next slide, when you have a new product launch, we see that 6 months pre-launch to 6 months post-launch, there's an increase in interest for meetings and a need for more information at a little bit more frequent pace than a drug that's been on the market. So it's pretty typical with what we've seen in the past. We don't see that pattern of desired frequency shifting too much going forward. But what it drives home is what our understanding that it's new information that's going to drive more meetings, new information on products that our decision makers need to make their decisions, to run their business, and those are the things that are going to drive more frequent opportunities to meet. Next slide. The last question in the what do we do is who do we reach out to? And traditionally, the relationship is the representative from the manufacturer, your healthcare decision maker, and then a clinical expert, usually an MSL. And those are the primary discussion points and the relationships that develop as we engage with our healthcare decision makers. And that's been our traditional approach. Over time, we've seen interest in other experts and other roles by our decision makers. And in our last assessment, so in our last survey, it was very clear that all healthcare decision makers, payers and institutional customers alike, are really interested in having access to a broad range of subject matter experts. People who have experience in the financial side, contracting, population health, and in today's environment, with health equity being a concern, even experts from pharma that pharma can provide around health equity and programs and issues around that. So the expectation and the need within our healthcare decision makers for a broader range of input is really growing, and they're looking for that multidisciplinary approach. And the pharmaceutical representative is really becoming more of a coach who has a bench of experts that they can bring in as needed, or a coordinator that coordinates all of these experts and input discussions with the customers. So the role of the pharma representative is evolving too, and it's adjusting to be able to provide that. And the better that we can support that, the more effective our relationships and our communications with our healthcare decision makers and customers are. Next slide. So we've talked a little bit about kind of the use of traditional versus digital and more technology advanced formats, and their preferences for frequency and a team multidisciplinary approach to our customers. How do we, Renee and Gary, how do we better engage our customers, healthcare decision makers, in this environment?
Well, thanks, Earlene, and that's really a great question. And I think there's no question when I work with payers, which is virtually every day, there's still a big need to engage with pharma manufacturers and to get information. And that's just generally because the pace of innovation, whether it's pharma or non-pharma, in the payer world has increased, and they need to keep up with those increases. But, and it's a big but, one of the things we put in the polling question was, how do we get critical information out? And sometimes what's critical to a manufacturer and a pharma rep may not be at the moment critical to a payer. So it's really important to understand the more critical issues that are on the payer's desk, and payers do like to sort of set the timing of these engagements. But all that being said, because there's a lot of innovation, the pace of FDA approvals, especially with accelerated approvals, has picked up, and lots of therapies targeted to smaller and smaller populations, personalized medical approaches, treatment of rare diseases. These are all areas that payers are going to want to be more focused on, perhaps, than they have been in the past. And at the same time, as we saw, payers like to do a lot of this work on their own, or give it to someone in their organization to do by looking to resources online or at webinars. So it becomes important to have that breadth of approaches, and not necessarily always prioritize that personal approach, except when there's new and perhaps, critical information from the payer's perspective to give. And so there's a lot about personalization, and I'll let Renee chime in here to talk a bit about, sort of that personalized approach, and where sometimes, those payers' needs rise to the top.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So, the whole point here really is to kind of focus on a little bit of a shift between the push and the pull, and the fact that there is a greater dependence on the internet for information, and on-demand options. And as Earlene had mentioned, we have webinars such as this one, and podcasts, and a number of other types of informational options that payers have available to them that have become kind of an option that we all depend on. Not only, attending a webinar, but you can actually listen to the webinar sometimes on a recording. You can see the slide deck sometimes. You can refer to it later on. You can learn from experts. So really the things that can be pulled are going up, and the push options that are available through the manufacturers are still available and still very much needed. With such a breadth of new agents in cell and gene therapy, other rare disease treatments that are coming to market, along with some of our traditional chronic diseases that we need to address with new therapies, it's hard for payers to keep up with everything. So we need the expertise sometimes from our manufacturer account managers who are coordinating their team and individuals that are experts in these different areas. So we'll rely on you to tell us what kind of resources are available, get us up to speed on disease states that sometimes we haven't heard of before, but now are very common and are being researched, and drugs are in the pipeline for. And I think that as an account manager, if that's your role, the thing that you need to do is listen to each customer, each of your clients, and determine what the greatest needs are that they have, and then look to see what resources you have available through your company to help support them, whether they be pull or push. I think there's always going to be a balance between the two. There's definitely reasons why we need to have live meetings still, but probably the pandemic has just sped up some of the virtual options that we take advantage of now. And as one last thing, I was just going to point out, I thought of this earlier today, was, in the past when I used to have live meetings, people would have to fly in from different parts of the country to meet with me. There was a schedule where there might be delays in flights. There might be an emergency at the health plan. So by the time they arrived there, I no longer was available for a meeting, and they were sitting there waiting for me. So I think virtual meetings and virtual access has its place and has benefited us in some extent to keep access, to individuals, I guess, in a better way than we had in the past. I remember leaving a lot of people in the lobby, unfortunately, where the president, the CEO would call me in, and I'd be like, I'm sorry, I can't come down and meet with you. But now we have the virtual option as a positive for us. So a lot of exciting things happening, a lot of individuals, as Earlene mentioned, outside of the medical and pharmacy director, that can and sometimes get involved in discussions and education that goes on around disease states and new treatments. So always use your point person at the plan to kind of come up with a plan that's best for each individual account.
Thank you. Thank you, Renee. Thank you, Gary. So as we move forward, we've talked about how healthcare decision makers find information. The second question is, what formats are best with sharing that information in a usable way? Move to the next slide, please. So what we found is that digital formats are growing in usefulness. The informational usefulness, they were used in the past, but we've seen a significant increase in use of interactive and digital tools, even in the presence during in-person meetings. We've seen that a significant increase, almost double in what in the past healthcare decision makers thought was useful during in-person presentations, to use websites and interactive presentations and videos during in-person meetings with the rep. They find that extremely useful. Furthermore, if you look at their preferences for standalone resources, digital formats that they can access on their own, as we've talked about, interactive tools, mobile apps that are customized, and immersive technology that can be used to help understand products and digest product information are more accessible, but also used more and rated highly in terms of their value by our healthcare decision makers. Next slide. But again, traditional tools are still very valuable. Leave behinds, one of the staples of our messaging and our support for our customers, continue to be highly valued and highly used by healthcare decision makers. It's a source of information that they can have on hand at their fingertips. So it sort of meets in a traditional way that need to have information at the tip of their fingers at the point of time and what they need it. So, the uptake of the digital format is impressive and something that we can rely on, but we cannot forget some of the traditional tools that our customers continue to rely on. Next slide. The other thing that becomes apparent as we think about this trend for our healthcare decision makers to really become more open to and value the digital formats is kind of what they're using when they access information. Of course, in the past, it's been very heavy towards computers, work computers. And that continues to be the case. It's not surprising. We all work have our computers at work where we access information, and our healthcare decision makers are no different. But along with that, we see a continuing rise in use of smartphones and tablets to access information. And that information gets accessed on mobile devices across time. So for us, there are a couple of takeaways here. First, when we think of critical content that we want to communicate to healthcare decision makers, we need to make sure that we're presenting it in a format that's mobile ready and transferable between multiple devices for single use. We know that a single customer may access that information at work on their computer. They may go to a meeting where they need to bring it up on their smartphone or their tablet, or both in some cases, depending on where they're at and what they have access to. And we need to have content that's formatted and transferable across all of those devices. The second takeaway here is that the growing use of mobile devices and the use of multiple devices to access content kind of opens the window for us in terms of the opportunity to engage our decision makers with critical content. So we're not limited to their time in the office, but we can really have opportunity to engage them almost any time in any place where they have interest and space when they're looking for information. So definitely an opportunity for us to think about, and how do we include that when we're developing our engagement strategy. Next slide. So as we think of how use and preference for exchanging and sharing product information and content is realigning between the traditional and the digital formats, Gary and Renee, what tips do you have for better strategies so that we can meet the healthcare decision makers' needs?
Good question, Earlene. I think that, as we have experienced a couple of years of the pandemic and individuals having a variety of different offices, I'll say, we have our hybrid model where some people are at home, some are at their office, and some are doing both. We need to have flexibility in meeting the needs of the different payers, because every payer is in a different situation, and those in different positions within the same organization may be working in different environments. So we have to be flexible in making sure that the critical information that needs to be available is available in multiple formats, as you mentioned. I think that, I still refer back to print journals, but oftentimes I'm looking online for the digital options. So, you kind of hold on to your traditional modes of retrieving information, but it's so much faster sometimes if the information is easily accessible on the internet. And if you have a good relationship with your payer contacts, that would be the next person I would go to for information and have them gather it, whether through their medical affairs department or, if it's a contracting issue or an HEOR issue, to pull those people in too. So I think that, we just have to be aware of the fact that things have changed over the last couple of years. I think for the better in most instances. And the information is available through a lot more sources, and payers to varying degrees are using all those options that they have available to them.
And thanks, Renee. A very, very comprehensive answer, but I'll approach a couple of things and really stress the ability to have multiple options for communication with payers. And as you saw in that one slide, the leave behinds are important. Sometimes it's good to have a visual reminder, although, again, as I talk to payers, most of them are not carrying around as much of that information as they did before. But if those leave behinds also give them the ability, here's a URL in the leave behind that you can go to on whatever device you're using at the time. I think that becomes important. And also recognize that payers are still using somewhat heavily manufacturers' websites. They're using third-party independent sources like UpToDate, for instance, to get their information. They're synthesizing that, putting it all together, and then may wind up, after they've done that, coming to you for very specific answers, or maybe asking for a MSL to give them very specific answers to those queries. So again, it is stressing that importance to have that breadth of communication strategies. And while face-to-face meetings, whether they're live or virtual, are still important, recognize that in 2022, and especially in 2022, as we are evolving through whatever we're going to look like I hesitate to say post-pandemic, because we're not, but I think it's really accelerated the change in that multifactorial format. So you have to be prepared to know your customer and know their preferred methods of communication, and have those already at hand and already developed, so you're not inventing them at the time they request something. So I think at that point, Earlene, I can hand it back off to you to bring us down the home stretch on the presentation, the next segment.
Great, and thank you both. That was excellent responses. Can we move to the next slide? And clearly, virtual is here to stay. But is that 75 to 90% mix for virtual? Is that going to be persistent for us? There's no question the pandemic had an effect on us. And while virtual meetings and virtual exchanges were not unheard of in the past, it certainly by no means, had the extent of buy-in from our decision makers and how we was engaging with them effectively. But what the pandemic did was really accelerate that transition, which we saw in your poll answers, right? To the use of virtual meetings and alternatives to that personal tactics, right? So that moving. Now that we're coming out of the pandemic, we hear a lot of assumptions and about how people are feeling and what they want next, right? On one end, we're hearing that people are burned out from virtual engagements and they want to go back to in person as it was before. And then at the other end, we hear that people don't want to go back to in person. It's going to be all virtual all the time. And so what we really need is some clarity around what our decision makers, our healthcare customers really want in terms of how those meetings are going. And in-person meetings continue to be important. We see that nearly all of the people that we talk to during our survey said we want more in-person meetings, or we want the same level of in-person meetings that we've been having. So that just reinforces that those are important for information exchange, for relationship buildings, and they recognize that, and they really want to engage directly with the account managers and farmer representatives. However, and along with that, we've seen a greater appreciation of those in-person meetings develop. About a third more of our payers now say that they prefer in-person meetings when they didn't in the past. So a much greater appreciation for that. But virtual meetings are here to stay. They're in combination with in-person meetings. Our customers, our healthcare decision makers, continue to want virtual meetings at the same pace or even more frequent than they've seen in the past. So it's that mix and that combination that they're looking for that includes both in-person and direct, one-on-one, face-to-face, as well as some of those virtual meetings. So I think that's balancing, their time and their interest and their availability along with their need for that personal touch, that relationship building. Next slide. The second thing we see involving is the type of information the decision makers are looking for. What are their content needs? And of course, there's the big five, efficacy, safety, tolerability, cost, evidence, and data. Our healthcare decision makers need that. They want that. And that's never going to change. And that's always going to float to the top five, because that's what they're looking for in terms of product information. But we're also seeing some of the more socioeconomic type of information kind of becoming more and more important to our healthcare decision makers, both on the payer side and with institutional decision makers. And if we think about the media that we see and some of the discussions around healthcare equity, disparities in care, I think those are evidence, I guess, of that supporting evidence of that increased interest or realization on how the other kinds of information come into play in healthcare decisions, treatment options, and really the need to understand that. And particularly, we saw a significant increase in the importance of patient quality of life information and data, and a appearance of importance of health equity data. So, it's the kind of transition or the evolvement of looking at just out beyond the clinical aspects of the product to the overall contribution or improvement to life and to the quality of life and how healthcare is being delivered across populations. So that's continuing to grow and grow exponentially. Next slide. And then finally, the other evolution we're seeing in terms of healthcare is what I've called new influencers, and I use air quotes when I say that. But how much influence does roles have in the decisions around product coverage and product use? And we know we have pharmacy directors and medical directors, our traditional decision makers who continue to be very influential. But what we've seen is that quality directors and disease state experts who have always been part of the discussion, but their voice in the past has really been viewed as one of information, deliverers of information. And what we see growing in the past 2 to 3 years is that voice has been shifting from informational to influential. And we see that their peers view 90% of their peers view disease state experts as having a very strong influence in decisions. And for quality directors, 78% see quality directors and as having a very strong influence in decisions. So significant shift in terms of what their level of influence is in those decisions. So what that means is they're becoming a more important target for us in engaging and in different ways. We need to engage them in different ways because they're shifting from being information providers into decision makers and influencing through that mechanism to being an actual influencer of the decision. So that might change how we think about the type of information or how we're engaging with them in terms of providing their needs, because it's not a transfer through a middleman of information anymore. It's now actual influence. So, next slide. So as we're thinking about all of the things that we've talked about today, healthcare decision makers' needs for information, how they're processing that and accessing that, and some of the ways in which we see sort of the decision-making environment evolve over the last 2 to 3 years. Renee and Gary, maybe you could share a little bit about what do we need to do to engage our healthcare decision makers in more effective ways.
Again, thanks, Earlene. And another good question. And as you pointed out, and as the survey data showed, there's a lot of dependencies on, a physical versus a virtual meeting and the topics to be discussed. But I think from a payer's perspective, things that will certainly generate more interest. First of all, if you're introducing a product into a disease state that may not have been an area of focus in the past, but will be going forward because you're either introducing a first-in-class product or even a new mechanism of action that may change how that disease state's going to be treated. Payers want to hear about that first before the product launches in, sort of pre-information exchange type of format. And certainly afterwards, when you have more data, usually the published data to review, because that's when they're going to be bringing that before their committees for review. Other areas that you brought up, I think, is becoming more and more important. In fact, I'm actually leading a seminar tomorrow with payers where one of the major focuses will be around things like healthcare inequities and social determinants, becoming more front and center. And so what that does is bring new decision makers into the mix, as you pointed out, whether that's a quality director or even now some payers have positions where they have a leadership position in social determinants and healthcare inequities, and even the certifying bodies like NCQA are starting to focus on that. So be very aware of that and be prepared to meet with and address the needs of those people as well. At the same time, there's still the need to really listen to your customer, to hear what they have to say and how they want to meet and the types of presentations. And there's some coordination issues. So, I can, stop there and let Renee have the last word in this segment before we move on, I think, to some more polling questions and open the field to additional audience questions.
Thanks, Gary, for letting me have the last word, I guess.
You always get the last word, Renee.
So a couple of things that just to kind of reiterate what Gary's mentioned. the prioritization of who you meet with at the plan should really go through your plan contacts. So if you're working with the medical director, the pharmacy director, whoever your points of contact are the ones that should help coordinate your interactions with others within the organization that may need and utilize the data that you have available. So whether it's disease management, health and quality management, other individuals in the company that have a desire, interest, and job responsibilities around those areas that your information would benefit them, that really should go through them. So that would be like my golden rule for you, because sometimes when that isn't done, it's kind of concerning to those that are your points of contact that you're going around them and not through them to coordinate all the efforts. And to Gary's point, there's a lot of opportunity here for the future to look at areas that might be of interest and importance to the plan: population management, risk sharing, patient-reported outcomes, etc. But I think that as the pharma reps representing your company on multitude of different issues, the prioritization within your company should be looked at, but you should look at the prioritization amongst your account that you're assigned to, so that you can try to match those up. You only have so much time, and I always tell folks that it's great to have a presentation that might be half an hour or 45 minutes long, but when you get to the point of actually having the meeting, whether it's virtual or in person, you may only have 15 or 20 minutes. So make sure you use the best, use your time wisely, and use each minute you have to make sure that the key messages are brought across and information is received. And you can always follow up with emails, text messages, URL links, opportunities to, invite them to webinars, etc., and podcasts. So I guess that's my last 2 cents. Back to you, Earlene.
I hope that you've heard some tips and got some direction to help you think about how to embrace your strategy to address some of those issues. And just to recap, right, we've discussed a number of suggestions and recommendations on how to engage healthcare decision makers. At its core, effective engagement really comes from, one, understanding the preferences and policies for virtual and in-personal engagement and deploying an appropriate mix of the two. Number two, it comes from the influence of specific decision makers and understanding that that's evolving, and that the priorities for meaningful and targeting content is changing as well. So taking this into consideration as you determine your engagement strategy and developing your content is important. How do you incorporate some of those evolving areas as you develop that? There's also a need for us to leverage our decision makers and how they initiate and pull information. This would include things like having a solid search engine optimization strategy and program, and making sure that you align content and messages so that it is consistent in traditional formats and traditional tools across some of the more advanced technological and on-demand tools and sources that our healthcare decision makers really are navigating towards. And then finally, as Renee said very, very well, very clearly, is you need to pay attention to your users, your customers, understand what their needs are, their wants. We've always understood that, but you also have to take that to the level of what their experience is with your materials, your tools, and make sure that the design and the relevant communications are able to ensure not just the content delivery, but that it's accessible on a broad range of mediums and tools. And that's really where we encourage you to focus in terms of your engagement strategy. If you go to the next slide. So we're going to open this up to Q&A, and our contact information is available if you have questions about any of the information that we've sent, or about how we might be able to help you with your engagement strategy and execution of some of the formats and tools that our healthcare decision makers prefer.
Great. Thank you, Earlene, and thank you, Gary and Renee, for providing your insights. Let's jump right into our Q&A session. We just have a couple of minutes left here. First question, we have limited resources. What is the one thing we could do to improve engagement with healthcare decision makers?
Well, I guess having been one of those for many, many years, I think the most important thing is listen to your customer, listen to what they need and what they want, the who, what, when, where, and how. Who do you need to talk to? What do they need to know? And how do I need to deliver it in an efficient manner? Because as Renee pointed out, we're all time limited, and these communications need to address that time limitation and do it very efficiently and effectively.
Perfect. Thanks. Let's jump to the next question. Can you please comment on the value of leaving information behind so the customer can review it at their own time?
Yeah, I guess I could probably chime in on that one. Not only do you leave hard copy information behind, but you might leave information on how to access the information online. So you might be leaving behind information on accessing websites or URLs or other formats. So I think that, there's always a good chance that maybe some of the peer review articles you might want to leave behind might trigger your account to look online for more information or to use that to review. Sometimes that isn't something that you have easy access to, depending on which journals they might be published in. So I always found that to be a point of appreciation. I liked when they left something behind. Did I always get to it? No, not always, but sometimes I could also pass it along to someone else on my team that might be able to review it and bring the poignant points across. So always helpful.
Great response, Renee. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for all of your fantastic insights and information today. It was a pleasure to have you with us.